people that have joined us maybe. But we're just getting started. We'll start with introductions. I'm Tiffany. I lead the higher ed policy team at EdTrust National Office. Jaime, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, buenos días, everyone. My name is Jaime Ramirez Mendoza. I use he, him pronouns. I am a higher education policy analyst with Dr. Tiffany Jones at the DC office for EdTrust.
Awesome. Thank you, Jaime. So let's go ahead and just get started. Today, we're going to be talking about free college policies, but from an equity perspective, what's covered, who's covered. This isn't the first time we've done this. Some of you who are joining may have heard us talk about this work before, but what is new is that we've done an analysis that will come out next week looking at the most recent state level policy. So that'll be the focus of most of our conversation today, what things to really focus on when trying to ask questions about whether or not a free college policy is a good thing or a bad thing. And so let's just jump right in. Jaime, do you mind going to the next slide? All right, so the first thing we want to do is make this a little interactive throughout the conversation. So if you could use the chat function, what I would like you to do is respond to the prompt. What comes to mind when you hear the phrase free college? If people could add their responses to the chat. There's not a wrong answer, so please feel free. All right, okay, and I'm just gonna highlight some of the things we're seeing in the chat so far. Folks are saying covers only tuition. Other folks are saying I don't pay a dime, right? No out-of-pocket expenses. Some talk about access, but not necessarily support while you're in college. Yeah, Cynthia's keeping it all the way real. She said lies, right? Like it really only covers free tuition, but students, still pay fees, right? Others have mentioned, graduates without debt. I think, feel free to continue the conversation and using the chat function throughout the presentation. But I think the key takeaway here is that free college does mean different things to different individuals. And it's clear from your responses that you're well aware that what free college policies have meant different things in terms of what is covered, who is covered. And the last thing I'll say in terms of the responses is it's very clear from you all that you're concerned it's not covering enough of what's important about college success, which is the support pieces as well. So let's move on. Again, feel free to, if you have thoughts or ideas throughout the conversation, you can continue to use the chat function to stay engaged. We can move to the next slide, Jaime. Thanks. So I gave kind of a quick overview of what we'll cover today, but most importantly, we hope that you leave with some ideas or a framework of what kinds of questions to ask about a free college policy if you're wondering about how it might impact equity. Move to the next slide. Okay, so just a couple of things about the work that we've done in terms of our research. We've taken a look at state level free college programs. Again, we've done an examination this year of 23 active programs. In 2018, at that time, we took a look at about 15 programs. We also looked at some proposed programs as well. That's symbolic that these programs are growing. There are more states that have them. And again, what we learned from our analysis in 2018 is that just because something is called free college, it didn't always translate into increasing college affordability, especially for low-income students and students who struggle the most to pay. And again, this was important because the intention here is to make sure that, free college policies increase college affordability, and that's not always the case depending on design. So let's go on to the next slide. And so what we're going to do right now is just show a very short video, like 1 minute, but it does a really nice job at summarizing some of the main things that we learned from our 2018 analysis in terms of what the equity issues are at stake and for free college. So Jaime, do you mind starting the video?
Free college has become an increasingly popular idea. Sure, it sounds like a great thing at first, but not all free college programs are created equal. So what does free college really mean? For some, getting into college is like navigating a complex board game. Ironically, many free college programs shut out the very students who struggle the most to pay, including adults, returning students, and those who have to juggle school with work and parenting. The fact is, tuition accounts for only 20% of the total cost of attendance at community colleges. The other 80%? That goes towards books, transportation, housing, and food. Meanwhile, higher income students are already at an advantage, so high income students can afford to use their college savings to study abroad. Free college has become an increasingly popular idea. Transportation, housing, and food. Meanwhile, higher income students are already at an advantage, so high income students can afford to use their college savings to study abroad or use their free time for internships, while low income students might have to work a part-time job just to pay for books. And so the free college game ends up widening the gap between the haves and have-nots. But it doesn't have to be this way. Some states are trying to ensure that their free college programs are inclusive of everyone pursuing a college degree, including part-time and adult students, and go beyond providing tuition for low-income students.
Okay, thank you, Jaime. And so again, the purpose of us showing that video to you is because it does a great job of capturing the main themes and of course, what we were looking at in terms of what is actually covered and who it covers. And so right now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the framework that we developed when we began doing this work, because we would often get the question as Ed Trust, you're an equity organization. Hey, do you guys agree with free college? Are you promoting free college as a solution? And we would say, well, what do you mean by free college every single time? And that would drive whether or not this is a good thing that's actually helping students. And so again, the key parts of that framework in terms of what does it cover, try to address some of the issues already emerging from the chat, which is, are 4 years of college covered, or is a full bachelor's degree covered? Does it cover fees? Does it cover living expenses? Also, who does it cover? Are we just talking about students who are going to college full time right after high school? What about the 40% of students in higher education who go part time? And so these were the list of questions that we asked, and we put it in its own category because we felt like it was the most dangerous thing that we were seeing happening, which is this idea that if students didn't meet particular qualifications, that what they got as free college would then turn into a loan. So for things like moving outside of the state to find work after they graduate. And so again, we thought that was very detrimental, and it was really important to highlight that. Right now, the only active program where that happens is in New York at the state level, but it was showing up in proposals. And so we wanted to really emphasize that that was particularly dangerous. We can go to the next slide. And so in 2020, we used that same framework for analysis, but we added a couple of things. Specifically, we wanted to take a look at whether or not the benefits that the state are providing are extended in any way for students who are undocumented, as well as students who are either previously or currently incarcerated students. And this mattered from an equity perspective because of the group, who those students are, and especially because in terms of their demographics being, more likely to be low income, Black or Latinx, but also because these are student groups who are often already locked out of so many other opportunities to access financial aid to pay for college. And the narrative around free college is this is for everyone. This is about opening massive access. And we wanted to know if that was really true or not, right? And did they mean all students when they say all students? And so those were a couple of additions for the framework. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, so just a little bit more about our kind of methodology and how we narrowed down. There are other statewide financial aid programs that we did not include or categorize as being free college or college promise programs. It needed to be state level. There are free college programs at the local level. We did not include those in our analysis at this time. There are programs that have been announced, but not necessarily funded or implemented by the time of our analysis. Also, we didn't include programs that were what we would consider merit aid programs that require particularly high grades or test scores. We felt like those are specialized scholarship programs. Same thing to be true with like workforce programs and other things that are particular scholarships for certain majors. Again, those were much more narrow in scope. And so again, we were looking at free college programs that were a little more wide reaching. And again, you can read more about the details of our methodology in the report, but just wanted to give you a sense when you see the analysis and findings that Jaime is about to present, and there might be a program in your state, and you're wondering, why isn't that scholarship program here? It's probably because they didn't meet one of these criteria. So at this time, I'm going to transition over to my colleague, Jaime, who did a lot of this labor for the analysis to tell us a little bit about what we learned.
Yes, Stephanie. So for our presentation, we separated out our findings into two sections. The first being what free college programs cover. But before we get into that, I wanted to introduce y'all to a term known as a last dollar program. And for some free college programs, they're structured as last dollar, meaning that free college aid is applied after existing grant money, such as Pell Grants or state aid, is applied. So to get a sense of how this impacts the students directly, we have the scenario on the screen of a Pell Grant recipient who is enrolled full-time at a public community college. And in this particular case, the Pell Grant was already enough to cover tuition. And since tuition is covered by existing grant aid, the last dollar free college program provides $0 to the student. So the overall impact in this particular case is that the last dollar free college program provided no award to this low-income student, and now the student has less of their Pell Grant to cover other expenses. And as the video showed, at a community college level, tuition is only 20% of the total cost of attendance at a public community college. Which leads me to ask the first question in our audience. Out of the 23 programs that our report examined, can y'all guess in the chat how many were last dollar programs? See if I can pull this out. 22, 18, 22. Okay. I see we have a lot of optimists here. 23. Okay. So the correct answer actually is 14. Out of the 23 programs, there's about 14 that were last dollar. And before we kind of get more into the weeds of that, I kind of wanted to go over another term, which is first dollar programs. Unlike the scenario before, first dollar programs, their free college money is applied towards tuition and fees first. So students can then use additional aid, such as a Pell Grant or state aid, to cover costs beyond tuition. We also wanted to point out that in the following slides, there'll be these following symbols next to states. If there's a green check next to your state, that means that your state met the Trust Equity Standard Free College metric. And if there's a red cross next to your state, that means that it did not meet our metric. So as mentioned previously, the majority of programs are last dollar programs, where they provide minimal benefits to low-income students. And the states that have these last dollar programs did not meet our metric. And as stated before, they're on the slide next to the red cross. Our analysis also included whether or not free college programs cover any sort of fees. And these can range from campus fees, enrollment, orientation. And these fees can range in amount and often can be a significant barrier to enrollment for low-income students who don't have the ability to cover such sudden surprise costs. And unfortunately, we found that 6 of the 23 programs do not cover any sort of fees for students. When looking at what else is covered, we found that 10 programs cover at least 4 years of tuition. And one of the reasons our criteria requires at least 4 years of funding is to provide ample time for students to actually complete their degree. Because studies have shown that 27% of students at the community college level earn an associate's degree within 3 years. Our report also found that while all programs are allowed to use their free college award at public community colleges, only 9 allowed them to be used for a bachelor's degree at a 4-year institution. And having free college programs that cover both 2- and 4-year institutions has equity implications. Because if states limit free college programs to just public community colleges, they risk tracking low-income students into programs that generally have less funding, lower graduation rates, and have smaller economic payoffs compared to a bachelor's. Next, we did evaluate who is eligible for these free college programs. And one of the populations we inquired about was adult and returners. And we found that 9 programs provide benefit to this population. And this inclusion is critical because Illumina Foundation report actually found that 37% of today's students are 25 years or older. And there are millions of students who have some college but no degree that could benefit from returning to college. We also found that 9 programs allow students to enroll on a part-time basis, which provides them an affordable pathway for students whose work or family obligations may not make it possible for them to enroll full-time. In addition to this, one of our metrics looked at if programs required a GPA requirement higher than a 2.0 to maintain eligibility. And the reason for this is because institutions already require students to meet a certain GPA requirement to demonstrate that they're making progress towards a degree. And generally, that usually is 2.0. And a Brookings study report actually found that when free college programs add additional merit requirements, it actually limits the effectiveness and equity of the free college programs. And unfortunately, we did find that 6 programs do require a GPA above 2.0 for students. And before we get into the findings of our 2 new metrics, I wanted to ask one more question to the audience, which y'all can answer in the chat. Out of the 23 active programs, can y'all guess how many are available to undocumented and justice impacted students? 0, 5, 2, okay. 3, you're getting a little higher. So, Satra, you are correct. I don't know if you saw the report beforehand, but there are 12 programs that include undocumented students. However, this does not mean that there are 12 states that have programs for undocumented students. And the reason being for that is because some states have multiple free college programs. For the example on the slide, California, Maryland, and Washington each have 2 free college programs within their state. So these 3 states make up 50% of all free college programs available for undocumented students. And including this population is critical because all undocumented students, including those with DACA and including those with temporary protected status, are disqualified from any sort of federal aid. And their access to in-state aid and in-state tuition varies widely by state. So for the approximate 100,000 undocumented high school graduates every year, and for the millions of undocumented folks in the country, being included in a state-funded free college program may be the only affordable way to college. As for the justice impacted students, we found that 10 programs include them. However, there's a caveat, because even when programs do not explicitly exclude justice impacted students, their requirements can make it very difficult for folks to participate. And including both previously and currently incarcerated students has racial justice implications because the criminal legal system disproportionately targets and impacts brown and Black folks and communities who often have trouble finding a job or housing due to a criminal record. Additionally, some previously incarcerated individuals may be disqualified from receiving Pell Grants or federal aid depending on their convictions, and each state has varying policies whether or not previously incarcerated students can have access to state aid. Research has shown that correctional education programs can reduce the rate of reincarceration and are associated with fewer violent incidents within those prisons. For the millions of individuals who are incarcerated and the approximate 700,000 that are released every year, states can invest in their potential and successful re-entry to society by making them eligible for these different free college programs. In addition to all of our findings, we wanted to provide y'all some highlights and some bright spots of statewide free college programs. So in 2018, there were 0 programs that met all of our EdTrust Equity Standard free college criteria. But in 2020, that changed as Washington College Grant met all 10 of our criteria. This program is funded by a tax on businesses that mostly employ those with post-secondary degrees, which allows the state to provide guaranteed funding to all eligible students. This is a first dollar program that is available at both 2- and 4-year institutions, and it benefits all the student populations we inquired about, from adult students, returners, part-timers, undocumented, and justice impacted students. We did want to note that this state does have an income cap on a sliding scale that is based on the state's median family income. So an example would be a familia of 4 making about $53,000 or less would receive a full award that covers tuition and fees. And then there are partial grants available on a sliding scale for familias making up to the median income of the state, which is about $97,000. We also noted that there were states that expanded the pool of eligible applicants. For example, the Maryland Community College Promise Program eliminated their service obligation, which before would require students to pay back their free college aid if they didn't work full-time and pay Maryland income taxes after graduation. So they got rid of that requirement. And in addition, they changed their eligibility requirements, so now older and returning students are eligible. We also wanted to highlight Tennessee, which created a free college program, but it was geared towards high school graduates and left out the adult and returning population in the state. So the state policymakers created Tennessee Reconnect, which is specifically made with adult and returning students in mind to attend public community colleges and can enroll on a part-time or full-time basis. And lastly, we wanted to highlight California and how they provide access to undocumented students across the board. So for some context, undocumented students are not allowed to complete the FAFSA because they do not have a social security number. So this creates barriers because FAFSA gathers vital information for institutions to then calculate what students can pay and how much to award them. So what California did was they created an alternative to the FAFSA that provides institutions the necessary information to calculate the financial need of the undocumented students in the state. In addition, California provides undocumented students a pathway to establish residency, which then makes them eligible for the in-state tuition and all the in-state aid that they provide. The state went actually a step further by passing Senate Bill 68, which expanded the ways that undocumented can establish this residency requirement. And I'll pass over the mic over to Dr. Tiffany Jones to go over the recommendation.
Okay, thank you, Jaime. And so I'm just going to spend a couple quick minutes highlighting some of our recommendations, and I would love for you all to start thinking through what questions you have, and feel free to start adding those questions to the chat because we will be transitioning in just a few minutes to Q&A. So our recommendations for policymakers, of course, if they're going to do free college, first and foremost, it's important that they actually are making college more affordable with these policies, especially for the students who struggle the most to pay. It's important not to exclude student groups. All students should mean all students, especially because the students most likely to be excluded, like undocumented students, students who are currently or formerly incarcerated, part-time students, students who are returning to college, who maybe never had a chance to attend right after high school. These are student groups that already face so many barriers in accessing higher education and ultimately earning their degrees. So it's important, again, in the spirit of inclusivity, that free college is, the rhetoric and narrative is that these things are aligned and that they are truly inclusive. Also, what's being offered, is it actually making college more affordable? If low-income students, like in many cases, don't get any additional dollars because they're attending community colleges who do not have a tuition problem as it relates to affordability, if they're only providing additional aid for tuition at community college, they're not going to be helping low-income students, especially those that qualify for the Pell Grant. So it's important to think about how to assist them with all of the other costs that are important to their education. When students don't buy books because they can't afford them, it impacts their academics. So sometimes it's nice, sometimes policymakers feel like that's not our problem, that's not higher ed's problem. But again, higher ed can't be impactful, especially in today's environment, if students can't afford a place to live, food to eat, a laptop to work on, access to broadband, et cetera. These are resources, and again, that students need to be successful, that higher ed should be interested in accommodating where they can. Also, it's okay that on day one, if policymakers say we do not have enough support to fully fund in all the ways you suggested on day one, that's okay. What's most important is that the dollars being allocated are used to help the students who struggle the most first. And so in places like Oklahoma, they couldn't afford to be first dollar for everyone. So they said, we're going to put an income cap in place. So only for families up to a particular amount. But you know what? Over time, because we recognize there are families above this income cutoff who could use some additional support. So over time, we're going to raise that income cap so that more and more families can benefit. We like to really hone in and shine a light on that model because usually the opposite is done. It's, well, let's give everybody something. And we're not able to do much in terms of additional help for low-income students, but hopefully the program's so widely popular that over time it'll grow, and then we can use those future resources on low-income students. And that future may never come. And in the meantime, you may have wasted millions of dollars on students from families who can have far more resources to pay for college. So it's important, again, if you're going to build over time, that you prioritize the students who need it the most. I think great examples of programs growing over time are also in New Jersey. Recently announced their intentions to transition their program that was designed for 2-year colleges to some 4-year colleges as well, as one more example. I'll also say it was really hard for us to do analyses on who benefits in terms of low-income students, Black students, Latinx students, in terms of what dollars they get when states are not transparent about data, reporting data on who gets it and disaggregating it by race. I will give credit to Tennessee has been stronger than a number of other states here in terms of at least putting out regular publicly available reports on free college participation. I think it's also important to distinguish, though, what participation means so that students who receive additional dollars are, it's very clear to the reader in the audience versus students who qualify for free college. So sometimes programs, excuse me, like in Tennessee, offer things like mentorship as a part of their program. So if you're low income and you get no additional dollars because the program is last dollar and you attend a community college, but you signed up for free college and you participate in their mentoring program, in some of the data, you're looped in as a participant and recipient of free college, right? So I appreciate the steps that they've taken as a state to really put out some publicly available data and just encouraging states to disaggregate even further who's getting financial benefits versus those who are not. And lastly, I'll just highlight that free college programs, even if they do a great job at addressing affordability, are not the end-all be-all. States at the same time also need to be investing in the colleges that students attend so that they can support their success after graduation and make sure they get to graduation. The things that make a difference that the research suggests, such as increases in advising, making sure there's enough faculty have enough support and are effective, making sure there's student support. All of those things cost money. And so it's important that the colleges that are most likely to provide access, such as community colleges, minority serving institutions, have the resources they need to be impactful. So states must do both. Free college will not fix the whole system. So I'm going to stop there and so that we can pivot to the Q&A portion. Please add your questions to the chat function, just as you did earlier. And again, if you are interested in receiving access to the report that'll be released next week, you can sign up at edtrust.org/free college. But yeah, so let's take a look at what questions are coming in. All right, so we'll start with a question from Will. So Will's asking, are first dollar programs that are income caps more racially representative than last dollar programs? That's a great question, Will. What we found in our analysis in 2018 and 2020 is that programs that use some sort of income cap, which means everybody doesn't get it, only students from families earning under a particular amount, those programs seem to have representation in terms of who benefits. Their representation is more racially representative. And what we mean by racially representative means if Black people are 10% of the state, they're at least 10% of the recipients. We saw the opposite when programs did not use an income cap. Those programs are usually more likely to be last dollar. That's the everybody gets a little something type of program. Oftentimes, if Black people were 10% of the state population, they might be 5% of who benefits from the program, right? So they were underrepresented. And part of the rationale there is, when you had a smaller, more targeted group, states use their resources to offer more things as well. So those programs with the cap were also more likely to be first dollar, which means, again, they got some resources for those additional costs beyond tuition. And again, that group was more racially representative. So thanks for that question and getting us warmed up, Will. So I'm looking at the questions here. So there's a question, and I'm going to kick maybe over to Jaime to respond with any thoughts. But what would also help would be that students are considered independent when they are actually independent adults, living and supporting themselves on their own, not just considered independent when they get married or have babies. So just kind of this tension around achieving independent status as it relates to financial aid and how that might be impacted by free college programs. Jaime, feel free to chime in if you have any thoughts or reflections on that. I'm just being transparent. That's not an issue that we explored in our analysis. But if you have any reactions or reflections on that question, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, the first one that comes to mind is the Tennessee Reconnect. So it is targeted towards adult and returning students, but they have to be qualified as an independent student in order to be eligible for Tennessee Reconnect. And the thing with these federal definitions is that at times it can be very rigid. And I guess, in my opinion, it should be more student-centered and should have a little bit more ample leeway for really looking into the students' experiences, especially low-income students, Black and Latinx students who are in these institutions and might not know what they don't know, or they might need a little bit more help than other people. So I do agree with you that I wish students were give a little bit more leeway to be independent. And I have seen that the Tennessee Reconnect is the only program that I have seen that actually has that explicit language of needing to be independent in order to qualify.
Okay. Thanks for that answer, Jaime. We do have a couple more minutes for questions, so folks should feel free to add your questions to the chat. We do have a question that came in from Carla, who asked, how can high schools promote dual and concurrent enrollment so students are alleviated of some of the college costs? And the one comment I'll make, and then feel free to chime in, Jaime, with any thoughts you have, is it can be complicated with dual enrollment and financial aid, because there's been a conversation even about Pell Grants, for example, making sure that low-income students can use Pell Grants for dual enrollment courses. And there's some tension because folks are concerned there's a time clock and there's only so many courses and so much time students have with Pell Grants in particular. And so it can make it, people are concerned, one, about quality controls and dual enrollment, and then starting that clock too soon for students, and then them not being able to complete, let's say, a bachelor's degree and still have some of their Pell eligibility left. So there are some concerns about how to design financial aid policy in ways that are supportive. But the one thing I'll highlight there is, what is known, though, is that there is, by not providing aid for those types of programs, the students who struggle to pay for college are then not able to take advantage of them in the same ways that their peers are. And so I haven't honestly seen a lot of exploration within the free college conversation regarding inclusion of dual enrollment programs. As you can see from our analysis, so much of existing full-time higher ed students are excluded. So much of their costs are excluded from free college, that hasn't been as much a part of the conversation, how to include students who have not entered higher ed yet or graduated from high school, but would be curious to see how that conversation goes in the future. I don't know if there's anything you would like to add, Jaime.
One thing I would add is that when I was a college advisor before coming to Trust, my high school did have a dual enrollment program. And I would actually nudge advocates to provide an equity lens on who is being included in these dual enrollment programs, and at what schools within the district are these dual enrollment programs being are accessible at. Because at least in our school, they did a pretty good job at finding students who weren't at the top of their class, who were between that 1.5, 2.0 range, who were first generation students, who were on free college, or who were on a free and reduced lunch. So they weren't just targeting those students who were already excelling, they were actually targeting students who might not have access to these things. So that would be one way, especially if these students are low income students, they're on free and reduced lunch, and they already have the opportunity to do dual enrollment, to have some credit. So then when you do get to college, they are able to alleviate that cost. And I know there was also another question. Oh, I think Will already answered it. And it was in regards to using professional judgment to have students become independent. And Angela, to your question, is that the FAFSA has certain questions that it asks students to see whether or not they're independent. So for example, let's say a student they believe that they're independent, they fill out the FAFSA that actually says they're a dependent student, that gets sent over to the institution. What the student can then do is go to the financial aid office and actually talk to a financial aid counselor and be like, hey, this is my actual situation. And this wasn't encapsulated within the application. And then from there, the financial aid officer has discretion whether or not to use professional judgment to then change that within their profile. And then that can mean, potentially a little bit more aid. They can change their cost of attendance, things like that.
So we had another question come in from Sarah, and she's asking about any kind of bright spot examples of state programs that really make it easy to understand who's eligible for first dollar programs. She raises the issue that, last dollar programs tend to be simpler messaging. And so again, Jaime, if you want to comment, I'll get us started and just respond and say, when it comes to simplistic messaging, I think a concern is less about last dollar programs having simpler messaging. In fact, some might call the messaging of last dollar programs deceitful because students and families, especially those in high schools without access to guidance counselors on a regular basis, do not know that when you say free college, you don't mean free college, right? So they don't know that they're still going to get a bill from the institution. They may not even understand that institutions bill for tuition and room and board separately, right? These for first generation college students who, again, don't have access to advising, they may not even understand those concepts. So if they hear that in their state college is free, they might actually think it's free. So if anything, first dollar programs are better aligned with the actual message of making college free, which means even if they don't cover 100% of the cost, they cover much more of that, and they're less likely to get, bill is going to be smaller. But in last dollar programs, again, they may be completely on their own for those non-tuition costs. I do agree about some of the power of free college being in the messaging. In fact, there's been research that demonstrates increases in FAFSA completion and college-going behaviors in states that announce these types of programs. So we definitely know from the early research that it's having an impact on motivation and engagement and wanting to enroll in college is a very good thing. But where I think the messaging can get complicated is around not so much on whether it's first dollar or last dollar, but on who's eligible. So if you use an income cap, right, that does muddy the message a little bit. So the trade-off is you do get to target students from families that might need more support, but that is complicated. So when we say everyone, we don't mean everyone, and when you start deciphering that way. But it's also important to know right now, states may not be messaging that way, but that's exactly what they're doing, saying everyone, and they don't mean everyone, right? They specifically, right, in half of the states, they don't mean undocumented students. They don't mean formerly incarcerated. In most of the states, they don't mean students who are returning to college, who are not going right after high school. They don't mean you if you're part-time, right? So in some ways, it could muddy the waters by, again, using income caps to target resources. But in other ways, it's important that whatever complications are being added to the policy, as long as they're clear and transparent for students and families, is the most important step. And in many ways, states are already deciphering and leaving a lot of students out, leaving a lot of costs out, but they're not being upfront about it, especially in last dollar programs. So I'll pause there and see if there's anything you would add, Jaime.
Echoing the sentiment that I think the more universal the free college program, the easier it is to spread the message because there's less caveats. Like, for example, the Washington College Grant includes everybody. So they can literally mean if you graduate from high school, or if you're a returning student and you apply within the timeframes, you get guaranteed funding. As simple as that. As compared to, oh yeah, you might get access, you get access to the free college program, but it's only for tuition, and it's only if you're a citizen, and it's only if you keep a 2.5 GPA, and you have to. So the more caveats you have, the harder it is to message that up front, or risk having the student feel like they got duped.
I appreciate, and Sarah's just follow-up comment around, the term being free college being problematic, and perhaps being more honest by saying things like tuition-free college, right? That's more upfront about what's actually being offered. And that's an example of, other folks in the field would agree, and you see examples of that language being used. You often see debt-free college being used to try to describe what folks believe first dollar programs do, which is this idea that low-income students are not having to borrow anything or as much. So trying to go towards making college debt free, and that they're doing so by, again, this idea that the state is covering tuition, and then if you qualify for need-based aid like the Pell Grant, you can use that towards your other costs so that you don't have to then rely on loans to finance your education. That's why often in this bill are the language of debt-free college programs when they're talking about that type of model. Because again, most of the time when people say free college, they're thinking about those tuition-only programs at community colleges. So absolutely. We have like 1 to 2 minutes left. We could squeeze in another question if there's someone else has a burning question they'd like to share. And if not, that is perfectly okay. And maybe give you guys a little transition time to get to your next session. But just want to say thank you for your time and engagement. These are great questions and gave us a great opportunity to warm up sharing this information. Will is asking us, are there other solutions beyond free college? And, absolutely, we think there's definitely more on the college affordability side. Right now, even, I'll just say this, free college, first dollar programs, and then you are assuming you're going to use your Pell Grant to pay for those non-tuition costs. Pell Grants as is do not cover all your non-tuition costs. And so it's important that policymakers continue on the path of proposals to at least double the Pell Grant, which have been proposed at the federal level, so that, again, students will truly not have to borrow for some of those other expenses. So I'll stop there and say thanks. Jaime, any concluding thoughts?
What you just said.
Okay, if not, thank you all for your time and attention today. Alrighty. I think we just press leave, right? And then it closes.